14 is a fascinating chapter because it includes two incredible invitations. Actually, the first one is incredulous. The other is incomparable. The first one is inexcusable. The second one is inescapable. The first of these two invitations is an invitation to dinner. That's where I want to begin. It was an invitation to a simple dinner, and yet it was a trap. They were watching Jesus, but here's what they didn't know. He was watching them. I want you to notice three main things this morning. Number one, notice the bait. I believe they were simply using this man and his condition as bait. So the table was spread and the trap was sprung. But what they didn't know was that the tables were about to be turned. Jesus drops a bomb. He said to the lawyers and Pharisees, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" He touched the man nobody else wanted to touch, and he healed him. I want you to notice thirdly, the banquet, verses 16 to 24. You see, this banquet, whatever banquet he's talking about, is for everybody. You might even say it's for whosoever will. Do you really want to attend the banquet that Jesus is preparing? Or are other things more pressing, more important? Our plans, our possessions, our portfolios. Can I just tell you this morning that I don't know what excuse you may be tempted to use, but I would just tell you there's no good excuse to miss his banquet. Annie Dillard, in her essay, An Expedition to the Pole, describes the ill-fated Franklin expedition that perished because its preparations were adapted to the posh conditions of the Royal Navy officers' clubs in England rather than to the harsh realities of the Arctic. Listen carefully. In 1845, Sir John Franklin and 138 officers and men embarked from England to find the Northwest Passage across the high Canadian Arctic to the Pacific Ocean. They sailed in two three-masted ships. Each sailing vessel carried an auxiliary steam engine and a 12-day supply of coal for the entire projected 2 or 3 years voyage. Instead of additional coal, according to L.P. Kerwin, each ship made room for a 1,200-volume library, a hand organ playing 50 tunes, china place settings for officers and men, cut glass wine goblets, sterling silver flatware. The officers' sterling silver knives, forks, and spoons were particularly interesting. The silver was of ornate Victorian design, very heavy at the handles, richly patterned. Engraved on the handles were the individual officers' initials and family crests. The expedition carried no special clothing for the Arctic, only the uniforms of Her Majesty's Navy. The ship set out amid enormous glory and fanfare. 2 months later, a British whaling captain met the two ships in Lancaster Sound. He reported back to England on the high spirits of the officers and men. He was the last European to see any of them alive. Years later, civilization learned that many groups of Eskimos had hazarded across the horrifying discovery of various still living or dead members of the Franklin expedition. Some had glimpsed, for instance, men pushing and pulling a wooden boat across the ice. Some had found at a place called Starvation Cove this boat or a similar one and the remains of the 35 men who had been dragging it. At Terror Bay, the Eskimos found a tent on the ice, and in it 30 bodies. At Simpson Strait, some Inuit had seen a very odd sight, the pack ice pierced by 3 protruding wooden masts of a ship. For 20 years, search parties recovered skeletons from all over the frozen sea. Accompanying one clump of frozen bodies were place settings of sterling silver flatware engraved with the officers' initials and family crests. Another search party found 2 skeletons in a boat on a sledge. They had hauled this boat 65 miles across the ice. With the 2 skeletons were some chocolate, some guns, some tea, and a great deal of table silver. Many miles south of these 2 was another skeleton alone. This was a frozen officer. The skeleton was in full uniform, trousers and jacket of fine blue cloth, edged with silk braid, with sleeves slashed, and bearing 5 covered buttons each. Over this uniform, the dead man had worn a blue greatcoat with a black silk neckerchief. That was the Franklin expedition. Dr. Kent Hughes said, and I quote, "Sir John Franklin and 138 men perished because they underestimated the requirements of the Arctic expedition. They ignorantly imagined a pleasure cruise amid the comforts of their English officers' clubs. They exchanged necessities for luxuries, and their ignorance led to their deaths." End quote. Luke 14 is the story of 2 invitations. The first was an invitation to dinner. We saw that last week, verses 1 to 24. The second is an invitation to discipleship. Sometime after the dinner that Jesus attended in the home of a ruler of the Pharisees, he was walking, and Luke says in verse 25 of Luke 14, great crowds accompanied him. Jesus attracted crowds wherever he went. You know why? Number one, because of his message. He spoke as no one had ever spoken before. But number 2, because of the miracles. People wanted to see what he would do next. Kent Hughes concludes, quote, "In today's terms, there were throngs of gapers, hangers-on with no commitment at all. And they conducted themselves as if they were on their way to a holiday feast. So Jesus gave them a reality check as he laid out in unforgettable terms the cost of being a disciple." End quote. We pick up the narrative in Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 25. So would you stand for the reading of God's word this morning? Luke says, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." You may be seated, and may God add his blessing to the reading of his word. The invitation to follow Jesus is not an invitation to a life of ease and do whatever you please. It is not the promise of health and wealth and wonderful experiences, free from pain and problems. Any of you have a Christian life like that? Never a problem, never a trial, never a difficulty? Of course not. But much of what is being taught in our world today under the guise of Christian discipleship is completely foreign to what Jesus said. Dr. MacArthur adds, quote, "It's Christianity for consumers, Christianity light, the redirection, watering down, and misinterpretation of the biblical gospel in an attempt to make it more palatable and popular. It tastes great going down and settles light. It seems to salve your feelings and scratch your itch. It's custom tailored to your preferences. But that lightness will never fill you up with the true saving gospel of Jesus Christ, because it is designed by man and not by God. It is hollow, it is shallow, it is worthless. In fact, it's worse than worthless, because people who hear the message of Christianity light think they're hearing the gospel, think they're being rescued from eternal judgment, when in fact they're being tragically misled. The true gospel, Dr. MacArthur says, is a call to self-denial. It's not a call to self-fulfillment. And that puts it in opposition to the contemporary evangelical gospel, where ministers view Jesus as a utilitarian genie. You rub the lamp, and he jumps out and says, you have whatever you want. You give him your list, and he delivers. End quote. Now, I want you to notice 3 times in these 11 verses, Jesus introduces each qualification with a negative condition. So what do you mean by that? Verse 26, if anyone does not. Verse 27, whoever does not. Verse 33, any of you who does not. So he introduces these qualifications with a negative condition. What's it going to cost me to follow Jesus? What's involved in his invitation to discipleship? You may be surprised. Number 1, it involves 3 things. The first is abandonment. Abandonment. Verses 25 and 26. Jesus didn't call for a makeover. He demanded a total takeover of our lives. He challenged this crowd in Luke 14, and he challenges us today to acknowledge him as sovereign, as king, as Lord, as master. Not a one day a week Lord, not a sometimes Lord. He is Lord of all, or he is not Lord at all. In stark contrast to many of today's contemporary evangelical preachers who want to make it as easy as possible for people to respond to the message, Jesus did the exact opposite. He never called for anyone to pray a short, easy prayer to receive eternal life. You won't find that in the Bible anywhere. He never manipulated anyone to make an emotional decision. He never taught that the way to heaven was broad and easy. In fact, he taught the exact opposite. Matthew 7:14, for the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. He said in Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. He said only those who continue in his word, whose lives manifest the fruit of salvation, are truly his disciples, and only true disciples will be saved from the judgment of hell. Now, I want to tell you this morning, there are a lot of card-carrying Christians walking around this earth who think they've got fire insurance. And boy, are they in for a surprise. That's the only reason why they accepted Jesus. Prayed a prayer, raised their hand, signed a card, came forward, got baptized. That's the only reason why they did it, to get that fire insurance card, and then they could go on and live any way they want the rest of their life. And boy, are they in for a surprise. It's kind of like when you get insurance, and I'm not down on insurance. I've got insurance on everything I have. We have insurance on this church. Not against insurance, but have you ever had insurance, and then when it comes time to collect, they say, oh, well, that's not covered. Oh, that's happened to you too? I thought it was just me. I still believe in it, but boy, you better make sure. What's involved? What's involved in following Jesus? Well, first of all, in this abandonment, he says it involves people, number 1. You see verse 26? You say, Pastor, what people is he talking about? The people closest to you. The people you love the most. Your family. And what does he say? If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. You say, what in the world is that talking about? Hate my father, hate my wife, hate my brothers, my sisters, my children, myself? One commentator said, and I quote, the Lord's teaching that it is necessary to hate one's family is not inconsistent with the Bible's commands that children are to honor their parents, husbands love their wives, wives love their husbands, parents love their children. Hate in this context is a Semitic way of expressing preference. To hate one's family is to prefer God over them by disregarding what they desire if that conflicts with what God requires. It is to love God more and them less. End quote. Now, I'll just tell you, if you'll love God that way, you will love your family better than they've ever been loved their entire life. If you love God that way, if you, as Jesus said, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. That's the first commandment with a promise. The second's like it, love your neighbors yourself. You do those two things, everybody else will be thrilled with the way you love them. But if you put your family first and put God way down the line, the whole thing's going to be messed up. It's a matter of priorities. We don't just say Jesus first, we live and love that way. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing a lot of you have had those WWJD bracelets over the years. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that's great. I've had one. I never wore it, but I had it. And there's a lot of speculation about what would Jesus do. You know, you've heard all that. In fact, there was a preacher who preached a whole series on what would Jesus do? And I mean, he packed it out. Every week he packed it out. And I watched the video of the sermon, What Would Jesus Drive? Seriously. A whole sermon on what would Jesus drive. Now, I'm not really sure. I didn't see a passage or some verses in there or whatever, but he went through all of it. He said, some of you think Jesus would drive a Tahoe. And I'm going to tell you why he would never drive a Tahoe. And then he said, some of you believe Jesus would drive a Mercedes. And I'm going to prove to you this morning why Jesus would never drive a Mercedes. I mean, he went on and on. People loved it. They were clapping. They were cheering. You know, and I got to the end and I thought, Jesus walked everywhere. Nobody drove anything. But it's fun to speculate about that. I think he had another thing about where would Jesus work. He had known about where would Jesus eat. And he talked about all these restaurants, and he mentioned them all, I'm sure, so the people would go eat there. And it's fun to speculate about what would Jesus do, right? Do you realize this morning there is no speculation about what Jesus said? There's no speculation about that. And Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to love me more than anyone else in the world. There's no speculation about that. That's where it starts. Abandonment includes people. It also includes plans. Look at verse 26. He said, whoever comes to me and does not hate even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, he's not saying you hate yourself. You go home and cut your arms, or you slap yourself in the face, or you just say, what a loser I am. You're not talking about that at all. You know what he's talking about? He's saying when you follow him, it's the end of your kingdom and the beginning of his. When you follow him, it's the end of your plans so that you can follow his. Now, some will say, well, you know, hey, I got a great life. I mean, why would I want to give up the life I've got right now to follow Jesus? Oh, just one small thing? Eternity? Jesus said, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Then some will say, well, but I can have both. That's not what Jesus said. In fact, he clarifies it even more in verse 33. He says abandonment includes your possessions. See that in verse 33? So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Now, don't get excited. Jesus was not advocating socialism, which is the dumbest thing I've ever seen or heard of in my life. Go to any country anywhere in the world that practices socialism, and they have high taxes and low salaries, and people are starving. No, he wasn't advocating socialism. He wasn't advocating getting rid of everything and living a life of poverty. I don't know how long it'll take us to get to Luke 18, but we'll get there pretty quick. And once we do, we're going to meet a man called the rich young ruler. And he comes to Jesus. He said, I've kept all the commandments. I want to follow you. What do I got to do to go inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you got to go get rid of all your possessions. Now, Jesus doesn't tell that to you and I, but to that young man, he did. Because his life was obsessed with his possessions. He said, you got to go get rid of all that and then come back and follow me. And the Bible says he went away sad and he was lost. See, he didn't understand the call to discipleship. It was his unwillingness to surrender his possessions, to say, Lord, whatever I have, you have it all, that caused him to turn away, grieved, sad, lost. Now, here's the point Jesus was making, and the point he's making here. Every follower of Christ, every genuine disciple of his recognizes we aren't owners of anything, and he is owner of everything. We're just managers. We're just stewards. Now, you ready for the kicker here? If he is Lord of all, that won't be hard at all. But if he's not Lord of all, even the smallest sacrifice is going to seem like it's too much to you. So if you want to be my disciple, you have to renounce all that you have, or you cannot be my disciple. So the invitation of discipleship involves abandonment. Number two, it involves assessment. You see that in verses 27 to 32? There's a cost involved. If you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to sign up to be a follower of Jesus, there's going to be a cost involved. In fact, did you see what he said? He said, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So wait a minute, there's a cross involved? Oh yeah, there's a cross involved. By the way, what does a cross picture for you? Oh, it pictures my salvation. Oh, I wear it around my neck. It's a sign of peace. We've got all this stuff. It's a sign of love and all that. I mean, the cross, what is it a picture of? A cross is an instrument of execution. A cross meant death. It wasn't just two pieces of wood that looked pretty up on a hillside. No, a cross means death. And what did he say? Whoever does not bear his own cross, you're going to have one too. If you follow Jesus, he had his, you're going to have yours. If he doesn't bear his own cross, if she doesn't bear her own cross, cannot be my disciple. Kent Hughes said, and I quote, discipleship is a series of deaths, perpetual dying. Disciples follow Christ on a path of self-denial. We have to deny ourselves daily. We have to die to the flesh. We can't do everything we feel like doing. Debbie Boone sang a song one time, how can it be so bad if it feels so good or something? Whatever. Listen, friend, if you did everything you wanted to do, every one of us would be in prison. Can I get a witness? No, you have to deny yourself. He says disciples embrace suffering as a part of life. Now, nobody signs up for it. Nobody volunteers. By the way, there's a table in the lobby. I'm not going there. Nobody does. But that's part of it. That's what blows me away about the Apostle Paul, because he signed up for it. He said, I have suffered the loss of all things that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Philippians 3, 8 to 11. Now, if you don't admire him before this service, you better admire him now. That's amazing. He said, I wanted it. I craved it. I desired it. I chose it. What is your cross? Have you figured that out? Say, yeah, my mother-in-law. No. Well, my cross is the boss I work for. No. Your cross and my cross are the exact same. Every follower of Jesus, everyone who wants to be a disciple of his, has the same cross to bear. And you know what it is? It's doing the will of God no matter what. That's the cross. Whatever he says, we do it. It's going to cost us to follow Jesus. You don't hear a lot about that. Go to Christian bookstores and buy all the books about how to be wealthy and happy and successful and prosperous and all that kind of stuff. There's not a whole lot in there that Jesus said. They just speculate. Jesus said, it's going to cost us. And he never attempted to sugarcoat the sacrifice or cover up the cost. He put it right out there. In fact, did you notice here in Luke 14, he used two illustrations to make his point. He first of all talked about a man building a tower, verses 28 to 30. He said there's a man who was going to build a tower, and if you're going to build a tower, why wouldn't you sit down and count all the costs? Because you don't want to get the foundation laid and then not be able to finish it and have people come by and mock you and say, well, that guy, what a fool. He started that project, couldn't finish it. And then he used the illustration of a king going to war, verses 31 and 32. So what about a king who finds out he's about to be invaded? Wouldn't he sit down and say, okay, let me see now, I got 10,000 soldiers. He's got 20,000. Okay, what kind of weapons can we can't. Okay, let's send a group out there and let's try to negotiate peace before this happens. Man building a tower, king going to war. Builder of the tower was free to build or not, as he chose. The king was being invaded and had to make a quick choice. And in both illustrations, Jesus was making the point, we need to carefully assess the commitment involved in following him. Every would-be disciple needs to count the cost before they accept Jesus' invitation to discipleship. What's the cost? Every possession we have and everything we are, every corner of our lives. Conditional discipleship is an oxymoron. It is everything or nothing. I like what Chuck Swindoll said. He said, and I quote, God challenged Noah to defy his generation by building a massive ship out on dry land. He challenged an aging patriarch to sacrifice his only son on an altar, presumably ending any hope of fulfilling God's covenant he had made to him earlier. He challenged a speech-impaired, washed-up world leader to become Israel's spokesman in Egypt. He challenged a callow young shepherd boy, widely considered the runt of the litter, to stand on the field of battle against a man literally twice his height. He challenged the greatest Pharisee of his time, Saul of Tarsus, to renounce his impressive resume to become Paul the Small in the cause of grace. Each God-ordained crisis pushed each individual to the brink, forcing him to choose between fear and faith, comfort and commitment. Noah's faith preserved humanity from utter destruction. Abraham's faith made him the spiritual father of all those who believe in God. Moses' faith established the nation of Israel. David's faith put Israel on the map, literally. And Paul became the greatest apostle of grace the church has ever known. End quote. Why? Because each of those men, and there are many more, and women as well, who said yes to God no matter what. That's discipleship. The invitation to discipleship involves abandonment, it involves assessment, thirdly, it involves alignment. Verses 34 and 35. Now, at first, these two verses seem totally unrelated to what we've just read. But in the original language, the word therefore is there. You've heard me say before, when you find a therefore, you need to find out why it's there for. And the therefore normally connects what has just been said. And when you read it and understand it, you see what Jesus is doing. Therefore, salt is good. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. You see, he was saying being a disciple not only includes past relationships and present commitment, but it also involves future alignment or future allegiance. You have to stay, you have to remain, you have to abide, you have to keep going all the way to the end. That's what Paul said. He said, I've fought the good fight, I've finished the course, I've kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me, and not only to me, but all those who have longed for his appearing. All the way to the end. That's discipleship. But he uses the illustration of salt. Anybody here like salt? I do. I don't know why, but no matter where I eat, I put salt on it. Just a little bit. I don't put a whole lot. I put a little. My wife puts a whole lot on there, but I just put a little bit. And I like pepper too. I learned Many years ago, pepper adds a little bit of a flavor that I like, so I put pepper on there. But I put salt on that. My mother-in-law told us many times that you're going to die. You use too much salt. Okay. So I did cut back a little bit, but a lot of salt. Why would he use the illustration of salt? Talking about discipleship, salt. Warren Wiersbe said, and I quote, "Salt was a valued item in that day. In fact, part of a soldier's pay was given in salt." The words salt and salary are related, hence the saying, "He's not worth his salt." Salt is a preservative, and God's people are helping to retard the growth of evil and decay in the world. Salt is also a purifying agent, an antiseptic that makes things cleaner. It may sting when it touches the wound, but it helps kill infection. Salt gives flavor to things, and most of all, it makes people thirsty. By our character and conduct, we ought to make others thirsty for the Lord Jesus Christ and the salvation that He alone can give. Our modern salt is pure and does not lose its flavor, but the salt in Jesus' day was impure and could lose its flavor, especially if it came in contact with the earth. Once the saltiness was gone, there was no way to restore it. And the salt was thrown out into the street to be walked on. End quote. Here's the point. Temporary followers are useless to the Lord and His kingdom. Useless. Conditional disciples, you know those, right? Well, I'm in it until I have to do something hard or until it costs too much. Conditional disciples are worthless to Christ and His kingdom. Jesus doesn't want temporary disciples. He wants lifelong, loyal followers who will follow Him wherever He leads and do whatever He says and keep doing it until the day we're done. Either the rapture, which is my choice, or we die. Until then, we do whatever He says, wherever He leads. And I want to close my message this morning the way Luke says he concluded his comments to that crowd that day. These are his words. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Let's pray.